Hello and welcome to the Last Word on Spurs. We are your award-winning Tottenham Hotspur podcast. It is the evening after the day before. However you want to take that. We're joined by a very special guest on this show. Joining me as always, he's special too. I've got wonderful Matty Hayes back on me. Matt, David coming back to us here. How are you, my man?
Yeah, I'm good. Looking forward to a brilliant show, of course. Events yesterday could have been a little bit better, but we get into that in a little bit more detail. But yeah, plenty to talk about coming up.
Absolutely. And Matt, you won't get this, but you were doing such an amazing ventriloquist act there. You was actually talking about your mouth moving, which is absolutely sensational because we know you are so multi-talented these days, but that was on another level. So just that you know that, Matty, absolutely brilliant.
I'll try to fix that, sorry.
No problem at all. Join us on this Last Word on Spurs. A man that is on the Spurs beat, unfortunately like us, having to cover them, watch them, sometimes with his hands behind his ears or behind his eyes or in front of his hands. What can I say? I got the wonderful Tom Barclay with us. Tom, senior football writer, of course, for The Sun. Thank you so much for your time. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks, Ricky. Yeah, pleasure to be on again. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, good to talk all things Tottenham.
Amen. Thank you so much, Tom, for your time. Something it's worth saying, actually, before we do go right into the show, that you've got a little venture of your own coming up now. I know you've started your own little channel is going on. Give us a bit about that, because it's going to involve our football club, for the better, for the worse, I presume.
Yeah, I just thought I've started a little YouTube channel. I think the handle is @by Tom Barclay, as in by was how we write our bylines in the newspaper. So my good friend Alistair Gold, you will all know, obviously, and he is very, very popular with his YouTube videos, as you all well know. And not that I would ever hope to emulate Ali, but he obviously takes those sort of wider, longer view, kind of longer videos here and there. I thought maybe, apart from you guys, I suppose, but you guys aren't in the press conferences, maybe there was a bit of a gap to after press conferences, do little sort of 7-8 minute videos after games and then little features here and there. And that's what I've started doing, kind of giving it a little bit of a soft launch so far, but my plan is to try and do more of them. I've actually been off for a week, so that's why there's been nothing in the last week, because I haven't been in the last few games, but that's my plan. So hopefully we'll see if people like it or not.
Amazing. Tom, thank you so much. I'm right in saying, Tom, now, how long have you covered Spurs in general? We're going back a good 3.5 years. 2.5 years. 2.5 years.
Probably 2.5, 3 years. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I previously covered the likes of, I originally covered the Football League. So a lot of players who will have come through now at Tottenham, you know, like James Maddison, when he was back playing for Norwich. And then I started covering sort of South Coast and London clubs in the Premier League. Started covering the England under-21 team. Did that for 4 years, including the great win out in Georgia under Lee Carsley, who's obviously now the interim manager of the senior team. And as of last year, I started covering the England senior team as well. So I was there in Berlin all the way for England. Unfortunately, we didn't quite get there, but it was a great experience, along with Spurs for the last sort of 2.5, 3 years.
Amazing. It's interesting because I say a lot has happened, Tom, in these last 2.5, 3 years. You've seen a lot of changeover in players, managers. I think it's fair to say it's never a dull moment at Spurs. And obviously, we find ourselves in yet another, what many call a rebuilder project under Ange Postecoglou. Before we actually get into it, what have you made of Ange from the outside looking in? Because obviously you're in a lot of, you said, those press conferences week upon week. You've obviously spent a lot of time with the man. Give me an overview. You've spent definitely over 12 months with him. What have you made of Ange Postecoglou at Spurs?
I really like him. I really like him. And when his football is working well, which is a lot of the time, I know there obviously been issues towards the back end of last season, and there have been some frustrating results, I suppose, rather than performances from the 2 away games so far. And there are question marks until that starts to turn it around, which I think are pretty fair from Tottenham fans. But I love his style of football when it's going well. I did grow tired of the Antonio Conte end, which, you know, it's a classic thing in football where if a manager that doesn't play an attractive style of football, as soon as the results turn, no matter what kind of pedigree they come in with, and Conte is, you know, right up there, obviously, with what he's won, people grow tired of it. And I'm just a neutral. I'm not a Spurs fan. I'm just a neutral. But you want to watch good football. You know, obviously covering them a lot. I'd rather they did well, and and I just get a lot of joy out of watching good football, which is what Ange brings. From a journalist point of view, he's gold dust, really. I mean, I was at his first tour, obviously out in in the Far East with Australia and Singapore and Thailand. And even back from that first sit down interview we had with him in Perth in this very sort of plush hotel with Matt Barlow of the Mail, Ali Gold, and Charlie Eccleshare. Obviously, no longer doing Spurs, but a big part of Spurs' journalist sort of recent history.
You got away.
No, we miss him. He was such a good addition to press conferences. He's just a really good guy. But anyway, good luck to what he's doing now with the tennis. But yeah, even in that interview, we just got to really get a feel for what he's all about, his backstory. He's such a brilliant storyteller. Got so many interesting stories to tell. And obviously, the first half of, or during that first sort of 10-game period last season, when it was going so well, he wasn't just capturing the attention of the Spurs fan base. And for me, writing for The Sun, I obviously have a focus for, I have a sort of, what do I say, like a sort of customer base of Tottenham fans. But in a way, I'm often writing for the wider fan who is, interested in all clubs. And so when you get someone, whether it be Harry Kane, a big name, or if it be like an Ange Postecoglou that is a real interesting character that people want to read about, they want to hear about his, unusual, unorthodox backstory, and he's getting results and he's playing really good football. That's great. When it comes to press conferences, I quickly learned that he will take you to task or give you short shrift if you don't quite ask your question in the right way. Thanks to the guys at Haters who clip up a lot of the press conferences now. I've had a fair few of my interchanges with Ange go viral. From him mugging me off basically over calling James Maddison a bargain buy over 45 million or other things, wanting to give Richarlison or Brenan Johnson a cuddle. I remember a few of those, but they're all good fun. And I'm more than happy to be put in a position where someone is kind of, ribbing me a little bit if you get a good line out of it. And he's always good for that. The only time I'd say he wasn't so good for that is post-match. He's very different after a game than he is before a match. Now that's kind of the case for most managers, because those post-match interviews are normally quite quick. They're very just like reactive of the game. If it's not gone well, they're normally even quicker, and they're normally not in a good mood to really sort of elaborate on things. There's been the odd press conference, which you'll probably remember very, very well, after a bad result, which have sort of sparked interesting news lines. And, obviously that one where he talked about the fragile foundations was a pretty, it was like a wow moment. He's really trying to say something here. But most of the time he is much more, he's just easier to talk to, and he comes out with better lines and is just more interesting when in the day before a game, when he's had a bit more time to think about things. And one of the things I really like, just to wrap it off about from a journalist point of view, with Ange versus Conte, for example, is with Antonio, it felt like it didn't really matter what we were asking question wise. Not to say he wasn't really good copy, as we say in newspapers. Like he's a box office name and came out with some great comments, but it almost felt like he went into a press conference knowing what he wanted to say. Whatever you asked, he'd turn it into what he wanted to say. And that is the case for all managers to a certain extent. I'm sure Ange does that as well. But it does feel like that sometimes you can ask him like a slightly left field question, and he will think about it and give you an answer that he maybe hasn't really pre-prepared. And that can lead to some of the best stuff. And I'm sure you could go back through loads of those. I mean, I can't really think of specific ones off the top of my head, but I know there have been many of those, and that's great.
Just a very quickly, Tom, before Matt comes in there, have you noticed any change in his mood? I mean, again, you saw back in the last season of the nature, obviously, have Spurs results shifted from that great start of the opening 10 to then what they obviously ended up being with 5 wins out of the last 7 of last season. Did you notice at all a change in his mood at all at presses?
It depends. Like I say, post-match, after bad results, which there were quite a few of those, obviously, back end of last season with 5 defeats and 7, he did get decidedly grouchier at times, and you could see that on the touchline. I mean, I remember specifically that Chelsea defeat. Was it 2-0 at Chelsea? And because to give fans an insight, the press box is right behind the dugout at Chelsea. Chelsea's in a way, I find it quite hard to see the game, because it gives you an insight to what it must be like with a manager, because you're literally almost at the at the level of the pitch. So to try and see what's going on is pretty difficult compared to Tottenham. Tottenham's only a little bit higher, but there are some press boxes around the country where you're really elevated and you can really look down, and I find it often it's a bit easier to see what's going on. But anyway, you're also really near the dugout at Chelsea, so you can sort of hear and see certain things, and like he was going ballistic at times. I mean, particularly with Basuma at one point in that game, and there was more of those moments. But what do you expect? I mean, the results weren't going as well. He was, and he said it a lot in his press conferences, he was feeling like his players weren't giving him sort of 100% buy-in to his methods at times, which he kind of understands why. But that's what he thinks he needs for his style of play. He needs them to really embrace it, which one might say, could be kind of manager kind of speak to give him an out. But I also kind of believe it. And that's kind of what I think is so good about Ange. And I don't know whether at times, fans might think journalists are sort of buying his shtick, but I do think he's genuine around his philosophy, and with Spurs, I mean, I guess he's in slightly uncharted territory because he has had such success at all his other clubs. He's obviously won the league in his second season at every club where he's had a second season, but there's no getting away from the fact that this is a much higher level. Like this is just different, and this is where we're kind of in uncharted territory ourselves. We're going to find out whether he really is, all his supporters are he's cracked up to be, or whether it just doesn't quite work at this level and he's maybe too puritanical at times with his approach. I don't know. That's what's particularly for a neutral makes it really, really fascinating to see how this second season plays out.
Yeah, I think that's the mystery, isn't it? I think with him, Tom, that you just said there, because again, we've got a lot of, you'd say, we're very lucky to have a lot of listeners and viewers that are based in Oz that listen to the show and watch the show. And that kind of common theme is that give it to the second season, wait to see what this man's going to produce. Wherever he's been, that second season is always something of real joy. And that's, I think, what we're all waiting to see. Can he mould together a squad and a transformational rebuild to bring us something as Spurs fans? So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Matt to formally open up the show. And Tom, thank you so much for that insight.
Yeah, well, I think like you alluded to earlier, Tom, with the two away games we've had, the opening of the second season hasn't really got off to the start that I think Tottenham fans would have been hoping for. And yesterday, it really should have been third time lucky for Tottenham at St James's Park, having been on the end of painful 6-1 and 4-0 defeats on our last two visits to the Northeast. Postecoglou's side were impressive for large parts of the Newcastle United contest and had more than enough chances to win the game. Put Newcastle under pressure prior to Harvey Barnes opening the scoring with a well-taken finish, but we really upped the ante after the restart and managed to restore parity following Dan Burns' own goal on 56 minutes. Having opportunities to win the game after the equaliser, it was Eddie Howe's side who ultimately claimed all 3 points courtesy of Alexander Isak's finish. And with Tottenham, yet again, it seems under Postecoglou, left to rue a lot of missed chances. How did you see the game in terms of, I suppose, looking at the 90 minutes, but also what it might mean for the season ahead for Tottenham?
Well, I wasn't at this game, but I did watch it, obviously, on TV. And it just seemed very similar to the Leicester game, which I was at. And I can see how it must be infuriating from a Tottenham fan's point of view, and probably Postecoglou as well. I think when they were good, they were very, very good. And that's what gives me sort of a lot of confidence going forward, or excitement at least. I don't know about confidence, about depends what you want, what you expect out of Tottenham this season, I suppose. And that's the crux of where we're getting to. Like, if you think they should be winning the league or should be in a position to challenge for win a trophy, then are they good enough? Well, we've seen sort of a few a few reasons to doubt that already this season. But let's focus first of all on the positives. I mean, the style of play, again, when you come back to Conte, is just lovely to watch. They created a lot of chances. Nick Pope had a good game. It wasn't like they had loads of clear-cut ones, but I think if you keep playing like that, in terms of the attacking side of the game, over the course of the season, that will start to bear fruit. And the same with the Leicester performance. I mean, they should have really been 3 or 4-0 up. It's a constant theme that Ange has said throughout this his tenure of not getting enough bang for his buck, as the phrase he uses, from his forward line. And he's obviously added to that. He was missing Solanke. It really felt like that game against Newcastle. I know he didn't take his chance against Leicester, but that game against Newcastle, he was sorely missed already in that game. But they still had the chances, and they still should have sort of done better. I thought Brenan Johnson, when he came off the bench, I think we're going to touch on him later, so I won't talk about it too much, but that was encouraging to see. But then the downside is particularly the second goal. Just what we've seen before from this Spurs team, the high line being exposed from, all right, it's a good pass from Joe Linton, it's a good run from Murphy, but it seems, if it's one-off, it feels like, just how it goes. But the fact that it's happened a few times is a concern. And the way I would talk about it, and I'm always loath to sort of be too tactically critical, because I'm not the one in the dugout. I'm not an ex-player or a manager. But I suppose that's never a good enough argument, because if you don't go down that road of having to be a professional, none of us deserve an opinion if we're not. But when I look at what Eddie Howe did, and I come from this as someone who grew up a Newcastle fan, I'm not so bothered anymore. But I suppose watching the game, it was whenever I watch them, I'm kind of intrigued at least to see how they get on. And Eddie's also someone that I covered a lot at Bournemouth, so always interested to see how he does things. And he went into that game knowing that he had problems at centre back. Kraft played, who's been quite a servant actually for Newcastle, but is someone who is limited. And Dan Burn has definitely been a great servant for Newcastle, but he isn't the quickest. And the way he adjusted to that was to play his three central midfielders a lot deeper, and they played way more in the counter-attack, which is not that often that Newcastle have done that at home, as Spurs have seen to their to their cost at times. And that little adaptation essentially won the game. They were lucky, like, you keep playing like that and Spurs keep playing like that. They played that again. I think Tottenham might well win it or not lose. But the fact of the matter is Newcastle won. And that comes back to what Spurs fans, a lot of them must be kind of vaguely hoping they see at times under POSTECOGLOU. Will he change at times? Like he barely did last season. He did in that Man City game, which obviously they ultimately lost, but it was a weird game because obviously Spurs fans wanted them to lose. But actually the performance with an adjusted sort of approach was really, really good. And it makes you think, well, maybe he could do a bit more of that at times, and that could really get Spurs to where they want to be. But at this point, in these first two games, I don't know. Until it happens, you've got to be skeptical whether it will.
I'm going to read out a few of the stats from that game yesterday, Tom, and I want to, I suppose, with the caveat you just mentioned that Newcastle were happy to allow Tottenham the ball and to play in the counter-attack. But Tottenham had 66% of the possession in this game, played 415 passes to Newcastle's 180. We had 20 shots, Newcastle only 9, with the Newcastle defence required to make 33 clearances and 8 blocks, as well as 6 saves, as mentioned there by Nick Pope. However, like you said, as was the case at Leicester, Tottenham didn't manage to convert those chances. A couple of good chances, a couple of half chances, I suppose you can call them. And when you don't take those chances, you're under so much more pressure every single time Newcastle can get on the ball and can get forward. So if POSTECOGLOU is to stick with that style of play that we've seen for the last year, how sustainable do you think that could be at Tottenham to achieve long-term results and ultimately success?
Well, it depends what you mean by success. I mean, if you mean winning the Premier League, I don't think that playing that way every game will do it, because I don't think Tottenham's players are good enough. I think he can make a lot of the signings, and we'll come on to them, into really good players if he's given the time to work with them. And that's what's really exciting about this sort of young crop of players. But you've just got to consider what you're going up against. Man City are so good. Arsenal now look really good. And Liverpool have started like a house on fire. And, Chelsea and Man United, still think they're a car crash, both of them really, but they've spent so much money that you think they'll definitely be able to pull out a result every so often, like Chelsea did against Spurs in that game I alluded to earlier. Newcastle, they've got no Europe, and they've got, how many of those players would you take in Tottenham's team? Isak, obviously, Guimaraes, probably. And, there's a lot of quality in the Premier League, and then when you think of someone like Pep, who's, the yardstick for, beautiful style of play, he's adapted at times, as we saw in that Arsenal game a few years ago. You know, he played it long to Haaland effectively, or as near to do as Pep can get it, you know, launch it up the pitch. That was as near as he could do it. So I think there'll need to be a bit of adjustment. But you know, regarding winning a cup, if that is the ultimate aim, regarding getting in the Champions League, then yeah, because I think Tottenham, the way they play and the way Ange approaches it, can beat anyone on their day. And that's what's really exciting. Whereas if you have a team where they basically might keep it tight and they can sort of eke out results and maybe get lucky, I just don't think that's sort of a sustainable way of trying to do it. And that's what he's alluded to throughout the whole of his time here. He wants to, I know it sounds vague, but he wants to build, you know, success for the future. And the longer that goes on with nothing happening, the more people again come back to sort of manager speak and say, oh, what does this really mean? But I do think it actually does make sense the way he puts it. It's just now he's got to follow through with it.
Just on that point, you said about following through there, obviously on this point here, Tom, that, you know, the start of the season has been a bit of a strange one. You know, it's arguably brought a bit more promise with the 3 performances than we've seen in the second half of the previous campaign. But there are some familiar frailties that we can't get away from. And it is down to Ange to, of course, fix them. You know, he's the first Spurs head coach to last a full season in unbelievably what we're looking at over the last 5.5, 6 years. So we understand, like you said there, you know, he's undertaken the biggest rebuild the club has seen in many, many years. How confident are you, Tom, given that you've covered the club for quite a few years now, that he'll be given the time to build the Spurs squad in the shape that he wants to, given that it does feel that with the ball that we have got here, that whenever there's a feeling of panic and Spurs aren't going to be getting near that top 4, they tend to change and trigger the option of removing the manager. So how much time do you think Ange will get given the size of the contract he was given when he took the job?
Well, I think you can only judge, you know, a horse on the races it's run, and as the cliche goes, and I guess with Tottenham's history of sacking managers, you've always got to be wary of that. But I do feel like they've backed him with his kind of players. I mean, we're talking about this. We recorded a Tottenham Way podcast with Dan Kilpatrick and Tom Horner and Marcus Buckland earlier today, which will go up later. And we're talking about the transfer window generally. But I was sort of making the case that a lot of these signings are very Ange signings, which is a real positive. And then Dan actually kind of countered that. And I don't know if he convinced me. I think almost both arguments are kind of right. He was saying, well, yeah, but actually a lot of these signings, take Timo Werner out of it and he's on loan, are kind of the players that any manager would quite want to have. They're, you know, young, so full of potential, good pressers and really technically gifted. So with the modern style of play, like say, you know, if theoretically Ange were to leave and someone like Iriola, not saying, but just, you know, that is, you know, not saying anything about that being a possibility, but, you know, I guess he's like an up and coming manager, which is the kind of Spurs sort of model generally. You know, he would want those kind of players. So actually it kind of works both ways, doesn't it? It doesn't feel like it's just purely these are the players that fit Ange, like a Perisic for Conte. You know, that's a player that was signed for that manager, who other managers, and POSTECOGLOU, you know, prime example, you know, didn't fit him. So there's always, I guess, that worry. But I mean, I still think there's, you know, definitely big commitment from the club in the way it's going. You know, one good point that Tom Horner made was, whilst there might be frustration, and we all kind of came to the conclusion that we felt that a winger, you know, a prime winger. I know Odebear is obviously came for a decent figure, but he's obviously a young player. But a real top winger could be, or you know, wide forward could have been the difference maker in Tottenham's transfer window. But Dominic Solanke, you know, there aren't many. You know, was he the most expensive player to come in to the Premier League this summer? He definitely
was,
there.
yeah, 65
so,
million. Yeah,
right, and then think of all the other clubs and what business they did, or little business to the point, and life's just changed. And so I guess Spurs fans will be loath for me to, you know, praise the board for what they've done, but I guess a bit of perspective over what other clubs have done and the way the transfer window has shifted, apart from Chelsea, of course, and Man United. And it maybe doesn't look as much of a missed opportunity, but so many of those players are so young that it does feel like a gamble or a look towards the future rather than specifically for the here and now.
Just before Matt comes back in there, Tom, just want to ask you a couple of things. You mentioned about the way Spurs are set up and the way they're playing and maybe what their ambitions will be for this season, which we'll come on to. My only worry is that when I look at the way we play, and yes, it's great having a lot of possession. It's great seeing us create chances. I've got no doubt about it that I think had we had Solanke there, 100%, or Richarlison or Lancashire yesterday having a prime centre forward in that box, I think Spurs probably would have won the game. But my worry is that the formation, the way Spurs are set up, really relies on every single player doing everything correctly, and just one misstep from a defender and the whole thing falls down like a pack of cards. I think that's my biggest worry, that you've got to hope that every single player is on their A game and is 101%, 10% concentrated. One moment and it all comes crashing down. That's my biggest worry, because we're not Man City, we're not Liverpool, we're not Arsenal. We haven't had that investment in terms of the players. Do you think fans have got a right to be concerned about that element of it?
Yeah. Well, as Andrew always says, the fans have got a right to feel whatever they want to feel about it. But I think you make a really good point. The only thing I would say is, in the modern day game, that's true of a lot of clubs. When you talk about the pressing front three, not just of Tottenham, but of any club or country, if one player doesn't go out of all the front three to the press, it breaks down instantly. So I just think the modern game has changed a bit on that. And then you think of, to sort of again counter it, you think of Conte's system, which is very different. That also fell down when a player wasn't completely in the right shape, which is what Conte reiterated day after day after day, was shape, more team shape. So Postecoglou is not the only one. And it's not like with Conte, if someone did, as you say, got something wrong, it didn't cost the team, because it did. And we saw that over and over again. A team that, historically, or a manager who's historically been really defensively sound, just wasn't able to do it at Tottenham. And that was their undoing. I feel with Spurs, yes, that's a worry. And to be honest, I don't think that's ever going to change. I'll be really surprised, just with the way they play, as good a defenders as they can get in, or not, they've already got them, haven't they? As good as they can develop, Van der Ven and Dragozin and Romero, Nadogi and Porro, they're just always going to concede chances. It's just they're going to score a lot, and it's just whether you're up for that as a fan to a certain extent. I'm definitely up for it as a neutral, but it's up to you. And it kind of comes back to your question about giving Ange time. I do feel like the fan base have a say to a certain extent, and if sort of mood changes, then it becomes easier from the board's point of view to make a decision, not to pin it on the fans. Fans can, totally up for saying what they want to say. But, I was at all those games last season. I experienced the, amazing loving for Ange at the beginning. And I do think a lot of that was his style of play, and his honesty in press conferences and the way he carried himself. But I also think a lot of that was, something new and exciting, and just like the polar opposite of what we'd had with Conte. And once that started to, the novelty wore off a little bit and the results started to turn, it was a bit different. And I've got, some friends who are season ticket holders who go away, home and away. And, when you come back being thumped, 4-0 at Newcastle last season or whatever, there becomes a frustration. A lot of it can be knee jerk, because that's how fans are. And it's totally fair enough if you've spent all your money and time to go up to St. James's and you're coming back and getting stuck and you've lost, again, lost yesterday. But I also still feel that game against Man City was a big moment, that in terms of him misjudging the mood with the Spurs fans. I feel for him, because it was a really unique circumstance that, you couldn't have foreseen coming. But Spurs fans, everyone I spoke to, genuinely didn't want to win that game. And he just couldn't get his head around it. And I think he could have dealt with it in a better way. And he held his hands up afterwards. But I mean, I guess from my point of view, from a journalist's point of view, whenever we come to the end of this reign, because reigns always end, whatever way it ends, whether he goes to another club after the back of success or gets sacked because it hasn't worked out, that point will be a reference point in his tenure, whether it will be the moment where he really sort of changed up and realized, how that he got it wrong and wasn't quite as sort of rigid in his philosophy, and that actually in a way contributed to success long term, or whether it was the moment where the fans, love for him frayed a little bit. I don't know. I'm waiting to find out. Again, it comes back to the intrigue of this season.
It's fascinating. It really, really is. What we are going to do, we are going to squeeze in our first break of the show for our listeners on audio. We're joined by Tom Barclay, of course, senior football writer of The Sun. I'm joined by the wonderful Matthew Hayes. Matt, we're going to kickstart the second part and hand back over to you.
Yeah, aside from the concerns that Ricky just mentioned there, Tom, one of the biggest worries in the Tottenham fan base last season was Tottenham at set pieces. And I think at both ends of the pitch yesterday, Tottenham were much better against Newcastle, and we've heard that Nick Montgomery has taken a little bit of control in that department, and we're already seeing his influence on proceedings. Very little got past the Spurs defence in the air from free kicks and corners, and they just look a lot more organised with their hybrid zonal and man marking system, with the weaker players in the air marking opposition midfielders rather than big defenders and attackers, which I know seems like a simple thing, but wasn't often done by Spurs last season. Do you think Tottenham have overcome this issue, or is it something we need to kind of leave play out for a little bit longer before we can fully judge it?
I mean, the latter, and that goes for pretty much anything at this stage. I mean, August is so early. Players are still coming back. I mean, think of Man City. I mean, Kyle Walker hasn't even played for them yet because he's still coming back from recovering from the Euros. So, I mean, I do think any sort of data or any kind of conclusions you can take from what we've seen so far would be a bit premature. That's encouraging, though, that they've improved, because it was a massive Achilles heel and another generally, and that's what makes it so weird when certain incidents happen where he does seem to get it wrong, like from a PR point of view. He generally is so spot on, and that's part of his appeal, I think, is how he talks to you like the journalist, but I'm just a conduit we're just conduits for the fans, and he gets that as well. He speaks in a way that you can relate to, that he feels like he's giving you his real assessment, rather than managers who just sort of just get through press conferences and say as little as possible. And I thought his whole comment on the set piece issue last season was almost a mountain out of molehill of his own making. Like, I just don't really get. It was almost like he was in a bit of a narky mood. He really doesn't like it when journalists in particular sort of give him sort of tactical advice or kind of suggest, in that way. And maybe on that time, people were getting onto him about the amount of goals they were conceding from set pieces, rightly so, because he kept doing it, and it had to be asked. And he sort of came back saying, "Well, no, he was like, no, we don't work on them. We're not. It's not important to us." And they clearly are, because you look at Arsenal, look at how well they've improved in that side of things and what it's done for them both defensively and offensively. I'm sure it is for him too. He just didn't really want to admit it, but it became kind of snowballed into this bigger deal, to the point where now we're going into the season. I was at that Bayern Munich friendly where they conceded 2 set pieces, and you're thinking, well, this is going to be a problem again. But it's been better so far. Let's hope it stays that way.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the test Spurs have got coming up after the international break will be one where we're facing a side that have been, as we know, very accustomed to a lot of set-piece goals over the course of the last 12 months. And look, we have to flash back to, of course, the game for Spurs last season at White Hart Lane against Arsenal, and the manner of those goals and the conceded. I think you're right in thinking that, Tom. I think for me, the jury will be out to some degree until we've had a real consistent 10, 15 games to next judge it upon. But it's definitely, I think, as Matt has said there, 100% we've seen at least there to be some development in the way Spurs are managing that from set pieces. I think what we, again, can't get away from is that it was a concern. I think you mentioned it there, Tom. Definitely that presser. I was the same feeling as you. I wasn't too sure why it was a problem to say we are aware of it and we're working on it. That's my only thing to think. Why would it have been a concern to say, look, we're aware of it because we're conceding the goals and everybody can see we're conceding them.
But that's what I found odd, because it wouldn't. You could have just said, because at that point it wasn't a major deal. It was just like, they're conceding quite a few, but it's not like whoa. And it was just and it comes back to what I'm saying about him being, or one of his big appeal is being kind of the man of the people. Like, why wouldn't you just admit, okay, this is something we are working on, we know we need to improve, and then that's it, job done. And then because he didn't and kind of doubled down on it, and then it got worse, it became more of a big thing. But just looking to this season, I know he's obviously not played the last couple of games, but just looking at Solanke when he was at Bournemouth, I do think that when he's fit and playing, that should be a helpful addition, being on that near post, defending set pieces, particularly corners. That was a big part of his his game from a defensive point of view for Bournemouth, like Drogba or Shearer back in the day. So so that should help, because they've lacked that, haven't they, last season?
They have indeed. They have. And I think, like I say, we're at a point there when we look at what Spurs have done, obviously business-wise in the window, one of the players that it always seems, Tom, I don't know if you noticed as well as a journalist from the outside looking in, we always seem to find a scapegoat to some degree, a player that maybe isn't always a fan's favourite. I mean, look, in Brenan Johnson, he's a player that came in at such a high price tag at the time. You'll remember, of course, around the £50 million mark, that you just felt with Johnson that unless he hit the ground really running, he was maybe going to be under pressure in terms of the price tag that he was put upon him. 50 million he arrived for, of course, in the previous summer window. And his goal and assist return last season wasn't terrible at all. He managed 15 goal involvements in the first season. Probably was Spurs' best player on a day against Newcastle United. And I think where I'm out now with Johnson, for me, is I always felt this, that he was probably rushed into playing last season far too soon. I always felt that he was going to be pretty much kind of very gently bedded in. But obviously, you remember what happened at the time. Spurs had a whole host of injuries, which meant Johnson had to be played. And therefore, I think even for his development, it was, I think, way too soon to have had to play so many games on a consistent basis for Spurs. Whereas I think, for me, he does suit the club better, in my opinion, as an impact player. Someone that comes off the bench like we saw against Newcastle, that can really change a game with that dynamic pace. So I just wonder where you're at with regards to that, because I think what we have seen over the course of the first three, and we'll get Matt's view on it as well, I like Odebear. I was a fan of the signing, believe it or not. And I know many would have liked more of a marquee signing of Pedro Neto and Eberechi Eze. But there were traits in Odebear that I like. But I think what we can see from Odebear, he's really raw, really young, going to need time. And you've got a similar situation, I think, with Brenan Johnson, where you've got two wingers that are obviously not at that finished product and standard at the moment. And I think that's a really hard thing to obviously have to try and manage when, as Spurs fans, we're craving success, we're craving glory. We want this team to be able to compete. What's your take on it if you were Brenan Johnson? Where are you at, in your opinion, on him?
Yeah, I mean, you made loads of great points. Well, so I agree massively with, I thought he was kind of thrust into it in a way that Spurs weren't really planning, in terms of the injuries last season, where he was basically playing all the time, and they wanted to bed him in a bit slower than that. And I think when Timo Werner signed on loan, that actually helped Johnson, so he wasn't having to be relied upon so much. And actually his performances, whether it be off the bench or from starting, I think overall were better. So he should benefit from having more competition in a way. But he cost 47.5 million. And this, for Tottenham, that's a lot of money. So I don't think it's unfair for fans to be expecting at this stage, having had that year to bed in, a bit more. But I thought he was really good against Newcastle when he came off the bench. I think he's frustrating, isn't he? Like, from a fantasy football point of view, I really fancied him to have a really, and still fancy him to have a big season. But you're sort of like, from what you've seen so far, you're like, I don't know, maybe he hasn't quite kicked on yet, but he's still so young. I mean, there was a moment in the Leicester game which sort of summed him up. Really, I can see why Ange really likes him, because he loves obviously that pace out wide. He likes a player who can get in at the near post at the far post when the other winger on the left side is cutting it back, and he's proven that he can do that. It's, I know a lot of fans will see it and think, well, I could finish that, but you've got to be in those positions, and Johnson's got the pace, the anticipation to be in those positions, and he's getting better, I think, at his delivery across the box too. But there was a moment where what I really liked about that Leicester performance, even though overall with the ball he was probably underwhelming, is his work rate. And I can see why that would really suit the high pressing style that Ange wants to have. And there was a moment where he got back and put this brilliant sliding challenge in against I think it was the left back or the left-sided player for Leicester, won it, dribbled forward, then kind of like lost his way when he could have just gone for it. And then kind of fell over his own feet basically. And it's kind of like, that's kind of where you're at. You're like, you've got the ability, just have a bit more self-belief, which I do think was a bit of a slight issue in the first season. And I think they could have a real player on their hands, but it's hard because he's not just the one young sort of player in that position. They've got a whole bunch of them, and that's that's where it's hard for Ange, because I know he probably prefers having young players because he can really mold them to how he wants them to be, rather than a player who's a senior pro who's not having being told an old dog's been taught new tricks. I've come up with loads of cliches today. I don't mean it, but that's harder on him because he's got these other ones where the need from Johnson after a year is for him to show more consistency. Again, we're only 3 games in. I thought the Newcastle performance was pretty encouraging after, not so great performances in the first 2 games. If he can build on that, then that's exciting. But that price tag, until he starts doing it, is going to loom over him.
Do you think, very quickly before Matt comes in there, Tom, is he a starter for you, or is he an impact sub from what you've seen so far of his time at Tottenham?
I think he's a starter for Ange in his ideal 11. Right. I think he'd rather have him if he can rely on him and playing well because of the profile of player he is for the way he likes to play, rather than like a Kulusevski. But Kulusevski's a technically better player. He's obviously more of a experienced player and brings his own sort of qualities. But I think Johnson, you obviously got to persevere with him, but I think it's fair to be, after maybe international break, hoping for him to kick on from here.
Let's turn our attention to the business that Tottenham did this summer. And sporting director Johan Lange has discussed the success of the summer transfer window in a video put out by Tottenham on social media yesterday. He outlined the processes that were carried out in the window, which saw POSTECOGLOU's squad bolstered by 5 new members: Dominic Solanke, as we've already discussed, Archie Gray, Wilson Odobert, Lucas Bergal and Min-hyuk, who will join in January, all signed over the summer. Tom, what did you make overall of Tottenham's window based on the incomings? And is it fair to say that the signings we brought in are very much a project for the future rather than one where instant success should be expected?
Yeah, that is totally fair. I think so. My Tottenham way mate, Dan Kilpatrick, has got it spot on. And I think Tottenham are sort of building for the post Pep Guardiola era at Man City. If that ends, at the end of this season, I think they're sort of waiting to pounce to a certain extent. I mean, not saying to win the league, but to be in a better position because but then again, this is kind of what Spurs have historically done. They look for sort of younger, particularly British talents. They kind of went away from that a little bit and got their fingers burned with the likes of Ndombele and Lo Celso, finally left the club this summer to great cost from Tottenham's point of view. And it feels like they've gone back to what they know to a certain extent, albeit with the Johan Lang sort of spin on it with his sort of data-driven side of things. But, the likes of Archie Gray, that is the kind of signing that Spurs were making, in years gone by, and someone that I'm really excited about. And same goes for Bergval. Odobert, I haven't seen enough, but the fact that even if he missed that, decent chance where everyone says he should have used his head, I'm sure he, looking back, will think he should have done that as well for that particular chance. But the fact that he started both games already shows you how much that Ange rates him. So there's definitely got to be one to watch on that front. But yeah, I mean, it's just kind of, it just feels a little bit of a gamble if you're really trying to kick on this season. If you're more, from Spurs' sort of board and the fans' point of view, if you're more like trying to slowly build and buy more into Ange's methods, then it is exciting. But there are a lot of question marks around young talent. They're going to be inconsistent. That's what young players are, as we just discussed with Brenan Johnson. And even someone like Dominic Solanke, who I think, it's hard to see on paper a more well-suited signing in the Premier League for me this summer. I mean, it might be a few, but he's definitely up there because of his attributes that he showed last season at Bournemouth. He's a reliable finisher. He might not be the best, he's not a Harry Kane finisher, but he gets in those positions and he sticks a lot of them away. And with the way Spurs play with those cutbacks, that will be a big sort of plus. His pressing, as we know, was the best from a centre forward in the Premier League last year. That's a huge asset to Ange. His ability to hold up the ball. He's a technically good player. He's ironically, he's injured right now, but generally he's always fit. I mean, the injury he sustained was from someone falling on him. That's just bad luck. It's not like, the kind of player who just picks up various injuries. So it makes a lot of sense. But even with him, he was doing it for Bournemouth, who are a good team, but the pressure is at another level. So until you've seen it, we can't go, oh, that'll definitely work, because even if it does on paper, you don't know until it happens. I mean, you see it when players go into the international level and you think, oh, they'll definitely be great in that team. And it just doesn't quite click. So to step up, I have confidence that it will be a good, not just a good signing, a very good signing. But until we see it, which kind of goes for the rest of these players, you have to say the jury's out, I guess.
I think what I will say, Tom, is I think the reason why there may be some element of frustration amongst the fan base with this particular window is that when you've got the likes of Mickey van der Ven, Christian Romero coming out saying they want to win silverware, and POSTECOGLOU saying that in his second season, normally something happens along those lines. Usually he wins in his second season. You said it there at your opening line when we asked you about the transfer window. You said that's a transfer window. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe one, maybe not right for now in terms of winning, but for the future once Guardiola departs. Can you understand maybe the contrast? You've got players coming out suggesting they want to win trophies. And saying the second season he's used to winning, and we've had a window like the window we've had. And that's not to downplay the players that we've signed, but it just doesn't really correlate. When you look at the players that we've signed. Can you understand that?
I do, yeah, I understand. I more understand from the fans' point of view because, and I feel this when I'm in the ground, less so now, but particularly towards that Conte period where Daniel Levy in particular was getting a lot of stick. Like just the pressure is just growing year on year without the trophy, without winning a trophy, and that sort of desire to get something now is getting to extreme levels, and so every time they give a bad performance or a disappointing result, or a signing that isn't quite what you hope for, it seems like it's amplified compared to your average club. And I do go back to that point I made earlier about the lack of business from other clubs. I mean, look at Newcastle; they barely brought anyone in. They didn't get their main target in Guehi. So Spurs aren't the only ones, and they did do actually quite a lot of business. And when you think of not to sort of pour to sort of too much praise on Spurs, but Newcastle were forced to sell two of their brightest young talents because of PSR. At least Spurs didn't have that issue, but I do think, I think what's frustrating is you look at the team and the way they play when it's going well, and you think they're really not far off it. They can beat the best teams, and not just like a one-off, like quite regularly. Like look how well they played against Man City last season in the first half of the season. Arsenal, albeit they were a bit of an unknown quantity at that time. Maybe that's a factor, but generally they can do it. So I felt a top quality wide forward would really take them to the next level. And I remember being in a press conference last season, probably around maybe March time, and I said, and the subject of signing £100 million player came up, and they basically just dismissed it. And you know how much money the club is making, so I can see why fans might be frustrated over that being out, completely out. But he was saying, I'd rather have two £50 million players. But £50 million players these days, that is top, that is genuine, that's high quality. And I feel like, Odegaard came for a pretty sizable fee, but to kick on Spurs to the next level, I feel like, and maybe he'll turn out to be brilliant, but a top quality wide forward could have taken them to the next level. And I know Neto has such injury problems, and the way Spurs play and the way Ange trains, players get hamstring problems anyway, even if they're not susceptible to them. So they're probably never going to go near someone like Neto. And to be honest, Eze's got his injury history as well. And from what I'm led to believe, the fact that Palace wanted the 60 million up front was a bit of a non-starter from Tottenham's point of view, because pretty much most transfers aren't done like that these days. But I can understand why that's frustrating from the Spurs point of view. And I guess, it comes back to what we said in the beginning, that we'll have to judge it in time. But I can see why fans won't be holding their breath at this point over being able to kick on to that level this season, with some of the players not being quite ready for that yet.
Yeah, absolutely. On the summer business, obviously, Johan Langer, as Matt brought into the case, has obviously been talking about this in a interview that he gave to Spurs Official, where he was reflecting on the business Spurs have done. He said, look, with every transfer period, it's an opportunity step by step to build the squad in the direction we want. I think this summer has been another positive step in that direction. Last summer it was about building a team, but this summer the emphasis was on building a squad. We wanted to improve the team. We have welcomed 5 players. All of them were long-term targets for us. They come with the right personality and the hunger to win and be successful with his football club. 2 of the most promising new men are Gray and Odegaard. Langer said both of them we followed for a very, very long time. Archie played a lot of matches for Leeds last season. Very exciting talent with a high ceiling. A versatile midfielder with both technical and tactical ability to play within our style of play. And I also see a clear future leader. With Wilson, we've known him for a very long time. He was in France before he moved into the Premier League. We were impressed by his transition to Burnley last year. a versatile offensive player, fantastic dribbler, a two-footed player. I mean, we've touched upon them very briefly, Tom, already. But what's your gauge in terms of how much game time you feel these guys will get? Because like you said, Odebear started 2 out of 3 so far. Archie Gray's been dipped into some degree. But I think the one thing that Spurs fans have, looked at to some degree at the moment, it is very early days again, I must state, very early days. Archie Gray yet to start for Spurs. Lucas Bergval yet to start for Spurs. And then when you consider that, the only player that maybe some feel is really a genuine player that walks into the first team is Dominic Solanke. On that basis, what do you really feel the impact the likes of Wilson Odebear, Archie Gray will have on this squad over the course of the season, which might be a hard answer to give as we're only match day, I've only just had game week 3. But what's your kind of feeling on it in the long term?
Well, I think they're really good signings for the long term. It's just, short term, how long it takes them to bed in. I mean, Lang sort of said it himself there. Last season was about building a team, and this one's about a squad. Obviously, they're in Europe now, so they've got the extra pressure of that. Reference the fact that, historically, Postecoglou's teams have had injuries before because of the intensity they train and play with. So you got to build and prepare for that with the squad. Gray, he likes versatile players. It was quite interesting when he talked about centre back the other day, because I know last season he talked about wanting to sign a further centre back after signing Dragozin, so a 4th choice. And obviously didn't do that, but he said, well, actually, I feel like Ben Davies can fill in there and Archie Gray. So he clearly thinks that, I know we saw that in pre-season against Hearts and one of the other games in pre-season that he played at centre back. So that's interesting that he sees him there. I do still think the hope is that he'll be the long-term number 6 for the team, but he's still only 18. Bissouma's obviously had the self-inflicted incident that he had earlier this ahead of the opening game. He's come back. He's done pretty well since. So it's on him to sort of nail it down. And Bissouma's frustrating. I watched him so much at Brighton because when he's good, he's so good. I thought that first month of the Premier League season last year, he wasn't just Tottenham's best player. I think he was it was arguable to say that he was performing better than anyone in the Premier League, and then got that sending off against Luton, and it kind of all went a bit south from there. So we know he's got it in his locker, and so it's not guaranteed that you throw Gray straight into the team because of having those players. And Bentancur, I mean, he's the kind of player that every amateur player just dreams of having his ability. I just don't quite know where he fits into these 3 midfielders that Ange likes to play with. He's not an obvious number 6. He doesn't play there that often. I know he did against Leicester, but not that often. He's not really the playmaker of a Maddison, but he can do it. He's not really got the energy of a Sarr, but he obviously gets around. So you sort of wonder about him. But I mean, I'll throw it back to you. I mean, are you wanting Bergval and Gray to be starting already? As exciting as they are, they're only 18. Leicester away was a missed opportunity, but it's a promoted team at home, first day of the season. That's not easy. I mean, maybe you could have played against Everton, but they won 4-0, so there can't really be any criticism there. And then Newcastle away, look at the last 2 seasons, how well, how it's panned out. I know they didn't win, but they played well and they were unlucky not to. So do you feel like they should be in the team straight away? And he has brought them on,
I mean, I'll let Matt come in as well. My only concern is because Matt knows how much I love the cups and they're everything to me, more important than the league, in my opinion. My only worry is that we're in a situation now where I wouldn't imagine Gray or Bergval are going to start against Arsenal because, like you've just said there, Tom, the nature of the Premier League and that kind of high-profile game, he'll probably go with the tried and tested, which does maybe give me a little bit concerned they'll be thrown in at Coventry away in the Cup, which some fans might feel that's absolutely the right decision because they do need the game time, and I totally get that. But Coventry away on a Wednesday night under the lights for fans that need a trophy, as we've touched upon, I don't want that to be a game that we really tinker in. I'll be honest with you. I want to see Spurs play their first team. Matt, is that me being fair? What do you think, Matt? Am I being unreasonable there, Matty?
I think that's you being a Tottenham fan, saying that Coventry away on a Wednesday is one of the tougher games we'll play. I think I do want to see the two of them start some games this season, but we also need to be realistic in it. Towards the end of the last season, I was calling for Mikey Moore to start some games, and I think when it got to the point where our season wasn't really salvageable, that was a good time to put Moore in. But Gray and Bergval are definitely at a much higher level, and I think we saw the fact they were brought on in the period of the game they were against Leicester, when the crowd were getting on top of us, we were under the caution struggling to control that game, that Ange trusted them in that moment to put them on. I think even I love the two of them so much, and I watched more than I care to admit of Bergval in Sweden last year. I rate the two players extremely highly. I think internally there is an even higher rating on them, which is absolutely fantastic, because I don't think that was the expectation when we brought them in. But for me, there are a lot of games there where we can start them this season, and I think there will be the natural rotation within the league if we pick up a couple of injuries when it gets to Christmas, when it gets to March, when there's games coming thick and fast. But looking at the Europa League, or 4 away games are quite daunting, so I'm not sure I'd consider putting them in there. But at home to Karabakh, at home to Elfsborg, for me, that's 2 games straight away that should be earmarked for the future, that the two of them can start, and maybe even that game against Alkmaar as well. So I think between the two of them, 10 to 15 starts each this season, those Europa League games, a couple of cup games if they are at home against lower league opposition, and a few in the league when we do need to rotate, for me, I think is a brilliant way to go. And I think it would exceed their expectation as well. So I'd be happy with that.
I'm interested in that. I actually think potentially they could have more than that. I think Bergval, when he first signed, I think Andrew said it, that he thought maybe that they might even loan him out, and he's impressed so much that they have to involve him. And I think you guys posted the interview I did with Pape Matisar the other day, and I asked him, of the new players, who's impressed you most, and he came straight out with it, Lucas, and he basically said he could be one of the best players in the world. So if Sar's saying that already, that shows you how much he's impressed the squad. And I thought Matt's point about them about to come on in the Leicester game is key, because it would happen when Bentancur got injured, but it was going to happen before that. That was actually irrelevant to what was about to happen. So he trusts them. I feel Maddison's performances in the last few games have kind of improved because of the pressure that Bergval is sort of exuding on him. And I think a key point is also the fact that Andrew's in a position now where he's got players that he trusts to bring on. Whereas I feel like with Lo Celso, he just didn't really want to do it. I don't know whether that was like he just didn't rate him enough as a player, or he just thought contractually he just wasn't going to be one for him long term. So there wasn't as much point in doing it. Whereas Bergval, as Matt points out, was coming on at that point when Spurs were under the cosh, and the way that Ange often works is, at certain points he wants to replace like for like, and the fact that he's ready to do that with those players suggests that the sky's the limit for them, really, and it could be now. If they can do well enough, he will play those young players.
I think the biggest thing that'll stand towards them if they do get more starts is they're both really versatile. Gray played, of course, right back the majority of the time last season with Leeds, can play in midfield, played in centre back in pre-season. I don't think he'll do that for us in Premier League games or whatever, but with Bergval, he can play as a number 8, he can play as a more advanced number 10, and even a couple of times last season he played up front, and he wasn't great at it, but he did it, so it's maybe in his locker. But yeah, the two of them I think will be more involved than maybe most expect this season. I want to ask you a little bit about Yang Min-hyuk, Tom, because he's of course not going to come in until January, but what I said, having looked into him after he signed him, is that he's not at the level of a Gray or Bergval. He's of course the same age, but I don't think he's been earmarked for as quick a journey into the first team as the other two might have been. I'm interested to get your thoughts really on what you think about the signing. Of course, this week he's been named in the South Korea squad to face Palestine and Oman. But coming in 4 months' time, what do you make of this deal?
I mean, I can't say that you probably know more about him from doing more sort of research into him, but I did obviously watch the preseason friendly against, it was Team K League, wasn't it? And you couldn't help but be impressed with his pace, his intensity of his play. He had that shot over the bar, but he looked dangerous. His technical ability, just the way he moved with the ball, was quite caught the eye. And you instantly thought, okay, well, if this is what he's like on a regular basis, and I've seen the stats and the accolades he's been getting very quickly at it's Gongchang, isn't it? In Korea, he feels like a good fit for what Ange wants to do. Obviously, that's South Korea is something that Spurs have got a big affinity, big connection with. I mean, I've been out in Seoul with Spurs, not this summer, but 2 years ago. And it is amazing, honestly. Like if you ever get a chance, Seoul's one of the most incredible cities in the world, but the love and affection for Tottenham, and obviously Sonny and that's why, is unbelievable. It's like nothing I've ever seen. Almost as loved as Alistair Gold out there. It is something to behold. And if Spurs can find someone who can, continue that kind of path, although it's impossible. You don't want to put that kind of pressure on him to say to anything to do with the level of Son, but you can see why they do it, and he seems to be a good fit. So makes a lot of sense.
It does. Go on, mate.
Let's talk about Solanke. The biggest addition that we've had this season. So much to analyse with those young players, but for instant impact, I think Solanke is the one that the Tottenham fans will be looking at most this season. Last year at Bournemouth, he scored a career best 19 Premier League goals, which tempted Tottenham to pay that £65 million on his services. And Johan Lange said, we were very committed to add another striker to the squad, and Dominic was our first priority. Stylistically, he was a very good fit for us. He's capable of playing in a possession dominant team, and he is aggressive in the box. Then out of possession, he has all the physical capabilities for the demands. Again, it is fairly unique to find a player with all these qualities at the same time. So we are very satisfied to get that deal over the line. Now, he's only been at Tottenham for 3 weeks and has only played once. In typical Tottenham fashion, played every game last season, but has missed 2 out of 3 so far this season. But the £65 million signing from Bournemouth already feels crucial to Tottenham's hopes of a successful season under Ange Postecoglou. Do you back him, Tom, to be a successful signing in Lillywhite?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of referring to what I was saying before. I think he, on paper, looks like an absolute perfect fit for the Ange Postecoglou style of play. From his pressing, from his reliable finishing, from his hold-up play, from his defensive attributes, which we talked about earlier, to his, ironically, fitness or reliable fitness levels. You're right. It must feel like proper typical Tottenham that he's injured already. But as I said before, it was someone landing on him rather than picking up a hamstring. So that should still be the case. And I think we may have seen a bit of it in that Leicester game. He's not a Harry Kane finisher, but who is? There isn't anyone out there who can do that. So he will miss chances, but I think he'll take a lot of them. And in this Tottenham team, he will get a lot of them. So there's every reason to be really confident that he'll be a good player, for a good signing for Tottenham. He's someone that I have watched a lot of because I used to, as I said earlier about Eddie, how I covered Bournemouth at that time. And it was a tricky time for him. If anything, his signing when he went to Bournemouth for 19 million, having only scored 1 goal in the Premier League, and 19 million at the time was a quite eye-catching figure. He struggled to live up to it, and it's not like Bournemouth went down because of him, but I guess it's about what you spend your money on, and the fact that he struggled. And the likes of Wilson seemed to struggle as well, did contribute to it. But he's a classic case of someone who went down to the Championship, rebuilt his confidence, because this is a player that burst onto the scene as a youngster, winning was the World Cup, wasn't it? Or the England Euros under 17 level, and was a player of the tournament. So, he's always been a huge talent, but he needed that regular game time to improve. I think he really flourished under Iraola, who's a really top coach, last season, and hopefully Spurs will see the best of it. And I know that, back to Hal, I know how highly he rates him, and he's someone who's potentially the next England manager. So I think Solanke, if he stays fit, will score goals, and it won't be long until he's probably in the England squad too.
Let's talk about one man that, to be fair, Tom, seems to have divided a lot of the Spurs fan base. He's barely played at all this season. I mean, again, such typical Spurs fashion. Timo Werner remained a Tottenham player for this season after his loan was extended. Obviously, having arrived in January of last season from a short-term move from RB Leipzig, he will be a Spurs player until at least June 2025. Spurs also hold an option now to buy him in just over 12 months for only $8.5 million. Werner did come in at, many remember, for a spate of injuries at the time, which at the time he started to really impress Spurs. He contributed to 4 Premier League goals in his first 7 games. He only managed just 1 assist in 2 months through that. He missed the last 5 games through a thigh problem. And to be fair, he did turn to that man consistently when available throughout his time at the club, originally in that first spell. And Werner did only lose just 1 game in the league that he started, with 5 ending in wins, 3 ending in draws before Spurs, as we know, limped over the line last season with 5 losses in their last 7. He did make an appearance yesterday at St James's Park. I think it's fair to say that there were groans from some of the away fans yesterday when Timo Werner was getting stripped off ready to come on. What kind of role, Tom, are you expecting Timo Werner to play this season? And were you surprised at all when Spurs triggered that option to bring him back for a further 12 months? Because I'll be honest with you, I think in a way that maybe just set the tone for maybe the window in itself, maybe for some fans thinking maybe it isn't going to be the most high profile. Not that we ever thought we were going to get marquee signings man after man after man, but I think that kind of maybe leveled the expectation of maybe what Spurs were going to do this window. Is that fair for me to say that?
Yeah. And back to an episode of Tottenham Way, which will come out tomorrow. Marcus Buckland, who's our host, and I've been on it before.
Can I say who we love, and we love Marcus on it. He's always very honest.
He's like our resident Spurs fan, and the way
he's great.
The way he dismissed Timo on this one, it was pretty brutal. I mean, I said last season when we were talking about signing him, whether Tottenham would trigger the option to buy him permanently rather than get him on loan again, that he wouldn't be a bad for the money, 15 million that was. Obviously, that not including the. Okay. Hi, Ali. Not including the obviously the wages that would come with it. You won't get much better value because that doesn't really go for much anymore, 15 million. But it's about what, if you're buying him, and does that mean you're not bringing someone else in? Back to our argument about bringing a top quality wide player. I think he was a solid contributor last season, particularly off the bench with the way Ange wants to play. Once you sort of forget about expectations over him scoring goals, those sort of that pace getting in behind a player and playing the ball across the box was quite effective. Perhaps it's the kind of thing that other teams can start to work out quite quickly. I still think he's got, with all these games, a role to play. I think he's better off the left than on the right when he came on against Leicester. I thought it was interesting that he came on there. But now they signed Odegaard. I suppose from Tottenham's point of view, fans' point of view, and the club, maybe you want to be putting more stock into players who are permanent signings rather than loanees. But I mean, Ange seems to like him, and I don't quite see the criticism as harshly as someone like Marcus or the sort of tone in your voice, Ricky, and clearly a lot of other Spurs fans do with him. It might be a little bit of a scapegoat for frustrations, but I also see where that's coming from too.
Matt, coming away on this debate, Timo Werner. Do you get it, Matt? Do you understand it? Now we're in the second season and they've obviously activated Werner to come back. Just as I asked Matt about Werner, his connection goes, we've got you, Matt. We've got you.
You got me? Okay.
You're taking a dignified silence there, Matt. Just say nothing good to say.
Me, never. Look, I think Timo Werner he's the type of signing that I think needs to work really, really well for it to be justified, because it's one that 95% of fans, I think, are against the re-signing in the summer. I think it was maybe a little bit more balanced when the deal was initially made, but I think he did well last season. There was a few games where he was really important for us, like the game against Brentford. I think of for starters, he really took that game by the scruff of the neck, and we scored 3 goals in 6 minutes to turn it around. There was a few games where he was really important like that, but when it's something that splits the fan base so much and that Tottenham were clearly so keen on when they got it done as early as they did in the summer, I think it's one that needs to clearly work and leave no one in any doubt for it to not be questioned and not be criticised. And so far, that's not been the case, and I don't think that will be the case. I think over the course of the season, I think the balance will lean more towards Werner contributing positively to the team, but the good is all right, and it's just the bad is really, really bad, and I think that's what will ultimately sway people against him at the end of the season.
Is Ali indicating Timo Barclay? Is that you in 5-a-side, Tom, or is he indicating there we should have got you instead? What do you reckon, Tom?
No, you definitely don't want that. You don't want that. If it was, as Ali will know well from our game against Tottenham in the media game last 2 years, you don't want me playing up front. But no, I think, like I say, I think Werner's not as bad as people are making out by any stretch. And I bet you he has a few moments this season where,
I think he'll be good in the Europa League for Spurs. Again, we've got games coming up there. There I go. I probably cursed it, but I think in the games in the Europa League, I think he will obviously be vital to obviously keeping a fresher squad, of course, for the Premier League. And ultimately, he's a Spurs player. I'm sure, like I say, we'll get behind him. I just think my worry, like I say yesterday, Tom, when you maybe look at the bench of Spurs, and look, granted, they're without Mickey van der Ven, without Dominic Solanke, they're out all Lancashire. We look at that bench yesterday: Forster, Spence, Davis, Devine, Gray, Bedson-Court, Bergal, Johnson, Werner. I'm looking at it thinking, what players are really on there that's going to change that game? And I mean that with all due respect. When I look at that Spurs bench, that, bearing in mind we've just come out of a summer transfer window, there's not a huge amount on there. You'd say that when the game was going against you, and granted, Johnson came on and did obviously contribute to Spurs, obviously equalising.
I was going to say that, to be fair. I know the game got lost, but Johnson actually was that difference maker to turn it around a bit. And look, Solanke's injured, so that's your premier striker not there. And so I think Spurs squad doesn't looks in decent nick. And that's kind of where, back to the original question about the business they've done this season. I feel like there are a lot more players now in this squad that Ange is going to trust to play. And he has to because he bought them. And that's exciting, particularly with the extra amount of fixtures. I just feel, and maybe I'll be completely proved wrong by Odegaard, who is whatever you think of the performances so far, it's very encouraging for his possibilities that he's already been thrown in the team twice. But yeah, I still feel like a top quality wide forward would have really seen Spurs kick on to the next level. But we'll see.
Fair. That's very fair.
Looking at the outgoings, Tom, and I think it's one part of the summer window that all Tottenham fans are in agreement. We did a lot of good business getting some players out, and Lange spoke about this in that interview with Tottenham as well. He said more than 10 players have left the first team squad. Some of their contracts expired, some left on transfers, some went on loan to get valuable game time. If you add the 3 or 4 January departures who left in the January market, it is an unbelievable squad turnaround. And looking at that huge overhaul that Tottenham undertook with that squad, Oliver Skipp, Emerson Royal, Joe Rodon, Eric Dyer, Ryan Sessegnon, Tanguy Ndombele, Pierre-Emile Højbjerg, Ivan Perisic, Japhet Tanganga, Troy Parrott, Brian Hill, Alejo Valise, Ashley Phillips, Dane Scarlett, Manor Solomon, and Giovanni Lo Celso have all left in some capacity over the last 12 months, with Sergio Reguilon and Alfie Devine expected to join them, potentially on loans. Would you agree that Spurs have been ruthless in their approach of getting those players off that wage bill this summer?
Well, I don't know about ruthless because they've paid up Ndombele, haven't they? So it's not like they've made a compromise like Arsenal did with Özil, but it's the right decision to make when you make a very costly mistake. Sometimes it's best just to sort of pay them up and move on. And the same could be said to a certain extent with Lo Celso, and that sort of speaks to the lack of money going around Europe at the moment, outside the Premier League. And we talked about the lack of spending relative to last year within the Premier League, let alone the other clubs. The fact that they've accepted less of a fee. You can discount all the young players on loan because obviously they're out for experience. But, Ricky, your point about, and I actually hadn't noticed this when you were saying about Ange is, what was it, the first manager in however many years to have a full season.
Yeah.
I mean, that is shown by all those players. That's a lot of players being signed by different managers. Højbjerg, who's been a good servant, albeit I know he divides the fan base. Team of Owner, he's a Jose Mourinho's player. He's a Nuno Espirito Santo player. He's not an Ange Postecoglou player, even though he actually used him a lot last season and appreciated his professionalism and the qualities he could bring. But he's just not what he wants from a kind of midfielder, so he had to go. Obviously, Ndombele, Lo Celso, Reguilon, all these. It's a mishmash, and what you would hope. Well, this is what I would hope from from my club is you'd want a sort of a strategy that they stick to over time, rather than giving up on it very quickly. And I think if you're going to be really praiseworthy of the Spurs business since Ange came in, there does seem to be that. There does seem to be a vision of where they're going. And that's really exciting. It's just back to our point about whether they are only 1 or 2 top players away from being ready to do it now. And have they spurned that opportunity? Which I think, Ricky, you probably would say they maybe have, albeit we will have to wait and see.
Yeah, it goes back to what I always say, is it also, where do you want to be? I mean, and the thing is, as fans, we know, Tom, where we want to be, quite where the board of Tottenham want to be. I think that's, again, an ongoing discussion that we have on these shows on a weekly basis, that I think, again, we enter yet another project, which I understand, everything takes time. Nothing happens overnight. Rome wasn't built in a day, pardon that pun. But I think this is where, again, I go back to what I said earlier about maybe comments around second season of success from a manager and players wanting to win trophies. Doesn't maybe correlate with maybe the business Spurs have done. It feels like we're in, again, more of a project right now rather than an emphasis to win right now. So it will be interesting. I think one player that, looked ever so good last season, in his first season for the club, was Destiny Udogie. I think it's fair to say that he does look really short of match sharpness at the moment. That's natural. Obviously, he was missing for the final 5 games of last season. I think, again, it underlined when he obviously played yesterday that he tried to, at one point, run back and he lost his balance when he tried to catch Murphy. And I think one of my biggest things about this window was maybe the lack of cover we've got for Destiny Udogie in this season. Now, I know we've got January, we can go back and address that, and also I recognise he's been playing Jed Spence there in the pre-season, almost on the left-hand side. So I just wondered, Tom, we talk about missed opportunities. In your mind, when you look at the business Spurs have done, and spoiler, we've got the Tottenham Way podcast coming out very soon, where you guys are going into this as well on there. Is that a missed opportunity to not have addressed bringing another left back as cover for Destiny?
I think so. You asking about the YouTube channel I've sort of started up. I did a little 10 predictions for the season ahead of the first game, and one of them was, I think there'll be that lack of cover at left back, which I was fairly confident that was going to happen. With the still window still had time to go, would be maybe a costly error. We'll have to see how much, but I just don't think you can rely on Udogie to be fit and available for every game because of the manner of the way Tottenham play. They'll probably pick up a red card at some point, probably get injured at some point. That's what we've seen in the last season. And he's such a good player and such a unique player to, well, not unique because Porro does the same thing, albeit in a slightly different way on the right-hand side, but it's such a specialised position, I guess, this left back, which the amount of times I see him playing attacking midfielder, basically. And then wasn't there one moment in the Newcastle game where he was offside? Shows how far up he was up the pitch. That it's really hard to find someone to slot into that. And I don't think Ben Davies can do it. I think Ben is an amazing servant, and I think he can fit in as the sort of fourth choice left-sided centre-back, but I don't think he can play in that position. Jed Spence is really interesting what's happened with him. I don't think many would have predicted the way he's come back into the fold, but based on the few games I saw in pre-season at left back, albeit it was against Serge Gnabry, so it doesn't get much harder, but he struggled. And I wouldn't fancy him against most Premier League opposition playing out of position. So when Udogie gets, when he's out, which will happen at some point, that's a risk they've taken. I mean, I'm pretty sure they had interest, and I think I wrote about this at the time, in Ito, who went to Bayern Munich early in the transfer window. Would have been a quite expensive player, but someone like that might have made a lot of sense because he could obviously play centre back, but he also could have played left back, and it feels like maybe he might have fitted into that. So if they could have got someone like that, that maybe made sense. But it's such a unique position to the Postecoglou way of playing that without that cover and the players they've got who would come in for him if he is absent, I think they'll feel it. And they did last year as well.
What do you think, Tom, about Van de Ven potentially being the left-back cover for Tottenham?
That would be my choice. Yeah, I mean, fair play to Marcus again. He was banging on about this for ages towards the back end of last season. And I think Dan was sort of dismissing Marcus, as he often does, and his sort of old man shouting at the clouds, like, you can't just do that. But finally, Ange did it. Was it the Liverpool game? I'm trying to remember. And even if Spurs, they lost that game in the end, I think. But he was, I'm pretty sure I'm getting my games mixed up. But anyway, Van de Ven.
It was City, wasn't it? I think he had a really good game against City. I might be wrong.
Or maybe he didn't know. Maybe it was Royale who played at left back against Liverpool. Yeah, and it was like, why don't you give him a go? And then he finally did, and he looked really good. And whilst it's not obviously his preferred position, and he's such a good player. I mean, what a player they've got in Mickey Van de Ven. But Dragusin, has been signed for a reason. Like, that would be what I would do, and I imagine that's probably what he would do as well.
I think there was one game in particular at home. I think it was one of the two that we didn't lose in the last 7 last season, where Van de Ven even got himself a goal, a brilliant finish from the edge of the box. Burnley, yeah.
Yes, where Vincent Kompany afterwards was going on about how this was the first step on coming back to the Premier League, and within a couple of months he was off to Bayern Munich. It's just like, oh my god. Anyway, but Van de Ven, he's great in that game, wasn't he? He won the game, didn't he?
Yeah, and I think my biggest concern, because I think, like you were saying, when Emerson played left back, a lot of Spurs fans have been saying give Van de Ven a chance out there. I think he played there a little bit with Wolfsburg and with Volendam as well. My concern was that Van de Ven in possession is brilliant with space around him when he can just power past the player and use his long arms to get rid of them. But I thought in a more technical position where you're operating in much tighter spaces, that I don't think it would suit him. I think he kind of dispelled those concerns just as good as he was. And again, that finisher at Burnley was one that the striker would be proud of. But you mentioned as well there.
Well, just one final point on that. I mean, but I'm not saying they should have signed someone who's as good as Destiny Udogie. It's about getting someone who's the similar profile who won't be as good, because you can't always play you can't have a 25 players who are first choice. But it felt like maybe there was an opportunity there to try and find someone. And I was surprised to hear that they weren't prioritizing that. I know there was only a certain amount that they could spend because of PSR, and they just didn't see it as a priority. But I just wouldn't be surprised if it came back to bite them. But I agree, Van de Ven would definitely be my choice to fill in if that situation arises.
You mentioned Jed Spence a little bit earlier in that discussion there, and I want to go into that in a little bit more depth. He didn't feature against Newcastle, but he came on for the last 20 minutes of the game against Everton in place of Destiny Udogie, and his numbers in a Tottenham shirt are continuing to increase. And having not been Antonio Conte's thoughts, who famously called him a club signing, and then Postecoglou in his first season as well, the right back is clearly in Ange's plans right now. I think not only shown by the fact he's still at the club, but by the fact that we didn't bring in another fullback in the window. Are you surprised that Spence has managed to turn a corner, and do you think he can now make his Spurs career a successful one?
Yeah, definitely to the first one. Second one, fingers crossed. I remember being in that huddle that we had where those quotes came out about the club signing. We were in Korea. I forget which ground it was. It might be in the second game. And we didn't bring him up. He brought him up himself, Conte, talking about Spence being a club signing. We're like, whoa, that came out of nowhere. Clearly he was trying to make a point, as he often did. I wouldn't look towards that season so much. It was more his loan spell at Leeds was very concerning. They obviously cut it short halfway through. Daniel Farke made a lot of points about, or references about, his attitudes, and that's definitely the sort of word that you were hearing around about him. And then Genoa kind of was a move that I don't think he really fancied, but it happened. And at that point, you're thinking, because I think Genoa had an option, didn't they, to buy him, didn't take it. And at that point, you're thinking, okay, what's going to happen? But I asked Ange about Jed ahead of the Leicester game because Spence is an interesting talking point, maybe not one of the sort of headline ones, but often the way it works with the press conferences, we have the open section, the live section, which you'll see, and then there'll be an embargo section, which I think is still filmed. So I'm sure you guys probably watch it later on. But sometimes so many subjects have been sort of covered already. You're thinking of some different ones. And Spence is someone that, I followed for quite long. He played for the under-21s, but one of his best moments actually came for Forest on loan when he scored against Leicester in the FA Cup during that run where they beat Arsenal as well. And so against Leicester, it felt like a fitting, and under Steve Cooper, his old manager. And Ange was saying, look, I asked him outright, there's been talk about his attitude not being good enough effectively, or being an issue. Has that not been a problem? And he said specifically, if it had been, you'd know about it already, and he basically wouldn't be here. So from what it's, by all accounts, it sounds like Spencer's, if he had an issue before, which it sounds like maybe he did, he's bucked his ideas up and has impressed everyone. And it's only a start, but it's very encouraging because there's a real talent there, particularly going forward. Yeah. So fingers crossed that can be a good signing for Spurs, and you can kick on from here.
I'm sure you remember, Tom, when we signed him, there was real rife competition for him. It wasn't just Spurs interested. I think it was a real coup at the time for Spurs to get Spence. So, look, I think we all genuinely hope that there's a player in there and we're going to see it through the course of the season. Two players that it feels like will probably head out of the door one respectively on loan. The other, Spurs, I think, would love to see it permanently, but we'll have to wait and see. That is of Sergio Reguilon and Alfie Devine. Now, I mean, again, I think Reguilon at some point in the window, there seemed to be an indication that he was looking for European football. I don't know how desperate he is now to get any kind of football. Obviously, we've got the windows to open in, respectively, Portugal, Turkey, the Netherlands. Obviously, Saudi window closes late tonight on the Monday. And then you've got Alfie Devine, probably needs game time as well. You know, and a really, you'd say, decent spell out on loan last season. What do you think the future holds for both, Tom? Which, again, I appreciate it's a moving window still at the moment with these guys.
Well, on Reguilon, I actually checked just before we came on air, and I finally got a reply to see if there was anything the latest on that. And there seems to be nothing at the moment. That doesn't mean things aren't happening with his agent or discussion happening, but it seems like nothing's close. I'd be surprised if he was still there, because Ange has made it very clear, you know, even if he stays, he doesn't sound like he's going to be part of the first team. He's kind of made his mind up on that, which is interesting, because left back, as we just talked about, is a bit of an issue. And, you know, one thing with Reguilon is he's actually quite a good technical player. So you think, maybe, is he not worth having a go in that position? Maybe he might actually not be a bad fit. But from everything Postecoglou has said, specifically in the last press conference, I think when I was off, but I think Ali was asking about him, and he was pretty strident about it, feeling like, I think he was talking about Lo Celso as well, who hadn't left at the time, and Reguilon, that their sort of days were effectively numbered. So you'd think something would be sorted out. Presumably his wages are quite high, but, you know, this is a player that was on loan at Man United. I thought he actually did very well at Brentford last season, or pretty well. So you think someone would come out of the woodwork across Europe. Alfie Devine, it sounds like, yeah, a loan is probably likely. I'm surprised he didn't go to the Championship. So it'd be interesting to see him go abroad. But, you know, I've just been writing about Angel Gomez today, who's obviously new to the England squad. He's playing at Lille, and there seems to be more English players playing abroad than ever at the moment. There are so many, whether it be from the top level of, you know, obviously Kane, people like Jordan Henderson, to young players like Bino Gittins at Dortmund. So it wouldn't be a surprise if you know, European clubs had been watching heavily. You know, I know a lot of scouts come to reserve games, or not reserves, under 21s, I guess, which obviously Spurs were fantastic at last season, and obviously had that loan spell as well where he did well. So that'll be interesting. But it seems like, yeah, more likely than not that he probably will go on loan. But we'll wait to see. Yeah,
we were certainly managed to.
One last question, Tom, and it's a big one, so you can gear yourself up for this one. We spoke a lot about Tottenham and the start we made last season under Postecoglou, only to fade away with injuries, especially after that terrible night against Chelsea under the lights at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. And a year on, it looks like the squad knows Postecoglou and his ways a lot better, especially with the newcomers coming in who are so brilliantly shaped towards what Postecoglou wants. And with the games we played so far this season, a couple of better decisions in front of goal, and Tottenham could very realistically be sitting on maximum points after 3 games, along with Manchester City and Liverpool. Instead, we have a decidedly mixed bunch of 1 win, 1 draw, and 1 defeat, with potentially Solanke and hopefully Van de Ven back for the derby against Arsenal when we come back from the international break, and some good training time for them over that break as well. It's looking maybe a bit more optimistic for Postecoglou in terms of the squads that he can put out in those games. And, you know, with an impressive performance in that game against Arsenal, it could really kickstart Tottenham's season. If we struggle, the mood gets a lot worse, and the kind of negativity continues to move around the fan base. I want to ask you how important that game is for Tottenham, that game against Arsenal, in the grand scheme of this current era, I suppose, that we're in. And off the back of that, how you see that game going, how do you think Tottenham can do this season? Where do you think we'll finish?
I feel like the performance is going to be quite important, and not necessarily the result, because I do think most Spurs fans begrudgingly would realise that Arsenal was sort of much further ahead in their project under Arteta. And to be honest, they've got better players, or at least players who, I'm not saying that Spurs players can't improve to the level of being at the same level or surpassing them, but that comes back to what we've been talking about, the potential that Spurs have signed rather than players for here and now. I mean, Marino's obviously injured, So that's unlucky for Arsenal. But the fact that they signed him and Sterling as well shows that they are going for it now, as opposed to building for the future. And they've obviously got lots of good young players anyway. And given the nature of the last time they played Arsenal and the sort of difficulty towards the end of the season and the results so far, I suppose, albeit not the performances, comes back to what we were saying about how the fans are feeling about the manager and where things are at. I do think, from a positive point of view, a really good performance, no matter what the result, but hopefully, at least one that they don't lose, could be a springboard to the rest of the season. I always looked at these early fixtures and thought, oh, this could either be, as I said, a springboard for something really, really good, or a bunch of banana skins. Well, not banana skins, because some of them are just really hard games, like Leicester away. Not really what you want from your first game. And as poor as Leicester are, and I still think they probably get relegated, particularly with the points deduction, and it's a missed opportunity from Tottenham, given the way the game went. You don't want to play the newly promoted team away from home in the first game of the season. Everton, you want that one. That was an absolute gimme. Everton are all over the place at the moment. So Spurs are really good, but you've got to win that. But if you don't win that, then suddenly the pressure's on. And then Newcastle always, never goes well, it seems, for Spurs, as proven. So, I don't know. it depends how much you guys. I think from a neutral's point of view, it wouldn't really, if they got beaten, relatively comfortably, sort of 2-3-0 defeat. If they were battered, then that's different. But if they were beaten like that, I would go, well, Arsenal just in a better place, and Spurs are struggling. But it was a bad game, but Arsenal just in a good position. It wouldn't make me go question the whole thing.
Right.
But okay. I don't know whether as a fan you might feel slightly differently. Are you starting to waver generally with the whole direction and Ange ball? And is it big? I don't know. It's an interesting question for you guys. Does it feel like a really important game?
I think Matt's got a lot more tolerance than I have. I think, Matt, you have got a lot more tolerance than I have. I think where I'm at, very quickly, Tom, and Matt can come in on this point as well, is that I am now more of the understanding that this is going to take a lot more time. I think the thing is, going into the summer, I felt that we were going to maybe give it a real push under Ange, going to give him some real, I hate using that term, marquee signings, but some players that were going to be real statement signings to really lead Spurs forward, especially after the previous summer. They brought in Maddison, they brought in, of course, the likes of Vicario, Van der Ven. And I know not every player can be a 10 out of 10. You get some rough diamonds in there. But my worry is that bar Solanke, and look, I think Graham, Bergal are really exciting kids, the same as Odebear. I don't see anyone that Spurs have signed that the likes of Man City, Arsenal, and Liverpool turn around and think, well, Tottenham are coming. And I'm not saying that they should be feeling that, but I think that's maybe why it's reflected with the fans at the moment, that with the nature that we're playing really well and we're not getting the results, that's not easy to take. And I think you're asking a fan base of 20, 25 years that haven't seen a trophy to still be patient, to still be part of a rebuild, which I think is really, really hard for some fans. And why every time I hear Marcus on Tottenham Way, I just feel like I'm always kind of nodding, thinking, yeah, I know the feeling, bud. I know the feeling. I mean, I was going to say, I think also Ange's, the way he talks kind of feeds into that as well, because it's not like he is saying be patient. Yeah,
which most managers do. I remember last season when he was on that brilliant start. Yeah, and asking questions like, effectively, can it get much better than this? And he was like, yeah, definitely. We'll be playing much better by the end of the season.
Let me get carried away.
Second season, I always do better. Like, he gives it the big one at times with the way he builds it up, which is really exciting and refreshing to hear. But you got to back it up as well, right? So 100%. If you're going to let the fans, get excited, now you got to deliver. So I can understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, Matt, you've got a bit more tolerance than me. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, I think on the point of the Arsenal game alone, I think I'm going to go the complete opposite way of what you expect me to do. I couldn't care less about the performance. I genuinely couldn't. I just need us to beat them. Like we had a few games in particular under Jose Mourinho against the bigger teams where we were terrible. We sat behind the ball, but we got a result. And I think in the derbies and games like that, for me, it just feels a little bit sweeter in a terrible way, because I so much prefer the football that we're playing now, and I absolutely adore the direction that POSTECOGLOU is trying to bring us in. But in a game against Arsenal, we just have to beat them, whatever it takes.
Do you want him to change it up then for that particular game, like he did with I know they didn't win, but the City game? Are you expecting something different tactically?
I don't think tactically, and maybe it would be worrying if we did, because we spent so long going in this direction that if we tried something new for a different game, I think everything would be all over the place. I think if we try and play the football that we do and we're terrible but we beat them, if that makes sense, I'd be happy. But I wouldn't want him to intentionally park the bus, I suppose, because that's probably just going.
No, I don't mean that. I mean like with the Man City game, and I guess that was smart.
But in terms of the.
So I was just saying, like, I don't mean like parking the bus. I can never see that happening. I'm just talking about like the Man City game where effectively it felt like Pape Sarr was playing up front for quite a lot of the game. Like he just sort of tweaked it a bit, and it was quite effective, even though they didn't win the game. I mean, like maybe a bit more of a, slightly less of a handbrake off on the bench. Yeah.
The thing is, I just think for me, Tom, that I don't think he will change. I think he's got his approach, and good luck to the guy because that's the way he wants to play. I think the thing is that as fans. I'm not telling fans how to feel or how they should think, but I think we have to bear in mind now that this is, again, part of a long-term picture where, let's be honest about it, it's not going to all happen overnight. And what I do know is that you can't just keep stacking managers. It just isn't going to get you success. You have to stick by a plan and stick with someone. But I do think that, like you said, Tom, results dictate managers' futures. At the end of the day, if Spurs do not get results and they are playing decent football, I think over time that will wear on. But look, I've said it before on this show. He's a great guy. Like all the journalists that have been on this show that have interviewed him, like you regularly say, he's a man of integrity. He's a man that talks so highly. I know many, like yourself, enjoy interviewing him. But at the end of the day, he's there to be a football manager, and he's not.
Exactly. Fair enough. None of that matters really. It's just it's like with Southgate, with people who are critical of him. Like, does it really matter that he gets on with the media or whatever? Not really the point. They're actually very different characters, and he can be quite spiky, to be honest, Ange. But yeah, I mean, that is irrelevant. What matters, if not results, then ways of playing, or it all comes into the mix. But it's about what the football team do, right? Nothing about anything else that really matters, and that's totally fair point. A good point.
Absolutely. We're going to definitely see how he gets on. Tom, a reminder, thank you so much for coming on tonight. Where can people find the wonderful work you do for us in the Spurs community?
Okay, so I'm mainly on Twitter or X now, at Tom Barclay _. I have started a YouTube account, as we said from the beginning. It's called, the handle is @by Tom Barclay. So I've just started doing it on kind of shorter videos, post press conferences, after matches, and maybe features here and there, and then also with my colleagues Dan Kilpatrick, Tom Allnutt, and Marcus Buckland at the Tottenham Way podcast.
Yep. Tom, we can't let enough. Been an absolute pleasure. I'm sure you agree, Matt. Always great to get somebody on that is so close to the club like Tom, and he's very, very lucky. He doesn't have to cover Spurs every week. He gets a break, whereas we don't, Matt, do we? Let's be honest about it. We don't get the break.
No, we don't get any break at all. No, it's been a brilliant show, Tom. Like Ricky said, we always enjoy hearing from those who are a little bit closer to the club, and I think the insight that you brought, especially about Ange Postecoglou's press conferences at the beginning of the show, on top of everything else, was absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much for your time. I apologise for my connection, and if I cut across anyone a couple of minutes ago, but yeah, really appreciate your time and enjoyed the chat.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate being on. Thank you.
You've been a star. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much, and girls, for listening. And over nearly 3,000 of you watching this live again. So we can't thank you enough for all your support for Last Word on Spurs. From myself, from Matt, from the brilliant Tom Barclay. We've been the Last Word on Spurs. We'll see you soon. And as always, come on, you Spurs.